Lawyers. What are the craziest last will and testament stories you had to deal with? Story 1. I worked at an attorney's office, and a little older lady gave her house and her belongings to a bus driver. The bus driver was nice to her and would help her. We were all waiting for hell to break loose when her family found out. Story 2. Military lawyer here. Had a young client come in for a will before deployment. He put in a request to be buried in blue jeans, a Chris Jericho t-shirt, and his replica WWE Championship belt. Happily, this airman didn't meet any misfortune on his deployment. Story 3. Not a lawyer, but a paralegal. We had a dying client in hospital change her will by recording it on a smartphone. It set a precedent and made the local paper. The lawyer in question has the page from the newspaper framed in his office. Story 4. The Great Stork Derby was when a wealthy Canadian left a substantial amount of money to whichever woman had the most children in 10 years following his death. It was upheld through numerous court battles, and 4 women tied with 9 children each. 2 women were also given smaller payouts. One had 10 children, 2 were stillborn, and another had more than 9 kids, but a few were illegitimate. The guy had some other interesting things in his will and was known as a practical joker. Story 5. Where I went to college, there's an oak tree that was deeded to itself in a man's will, now called the tree that owns itself. It sits in the middle of a road, and you have to go to one lane to drive around it. Story is that a man loved the tree so much as a kid that around the time he died in the 1830s, he gave the tree possession of itself. This technically wouldn't stand up in a court of law, but the county and local populace has accepted it and takes care of it. The original tree actually died, and the current one is a product of the acorns of the original. Story 6. I work for a lawyer who does wills. We've had a lady put in her will that one of her adult sons was not to receive his share until he visited a dentist, and the other son lost 70 pounds. Another lady put in her will that she wanted her cats cremated with her when she died. Told her that's not going to happen. Human remains and animal remains do not get cremated at once. So she settled on being cremated separately and joined together, then buried together. Typically, wills are about 10 pages for the average person. We had a lady who had a 56-page will. She detailed everything from her house to people. Wooden ladle to blank, toilet paper holder to blank, magazine basket to blank, etc. for every single item in this lady's house. We had a man put in his will that his family was to go to the zoo immediately after his burial that day. We thought that was more heartwarming. We had a lady that told us to put in her will that she wanted to be buried on her property next to her husband. She lived on a small rural property. Totally illegal to have human remains buried there. Refused to tell us whether her husband was cremated or not, and had dictated that she did not want to be cremated. Edit. Her husband had died 5 or 6 years prior, so it's not as though it was 50 years ago where things like that may have been a little overlooked. We work with many people from a certain religion. A lot of people we do will leave at least 90% of their estates to the church instead of their families. Wait, were her cats dead beforehand, or did this require the cats to be killed so they could be buried with her? Euthanized to be buried with her. I was so pissed off. I told the lawyer that's absolute bullshit. And though she agreed, she had to put it in as instructed and hoped that the living family members at the time of her death wouldn't uphold that part. Story 7. 2 sons of a really wealthy couple go to the family lawyer to have the will read. Lawyer is super nervous. He has known them both since they were kids. One son gets the entire inheritance, and the other gets nothing. The explanation was that it should be passed through to blood relatives only. So that was the day he found out he was adopted. I only heard of this through a friend, so I don't have the full story, but the reason it went to a lawyer, the person I know, was that it was being contested, so the disinherited son had to contest. I believe over the amount, not that his brother wasn't willing to give him anything. Crazy. Story 8. There was a case study in law school involving a man who was crushed to death by a tractor. He wrote his will in the tractor tire as he lay dying. The entire tractor wheel was then filed with the county registrar's office. Story 9. My dad is a lawyer, and a friend of my grandpa, who was in his 80s and had end-stage cancer, made his will. He was a big fan of weapons and wanted to give them to my dad. He's a fan too. He left him 2 shotguns, a Glock, and a revolver. My dad told him it would be better to write it in the will because my country's law says you can only own 5 weapons at a time. My dad already had 4 at the time, so he would have to give some up. But if you inherit them, it doesn't add to the limit. So they made a testament, and he gave him the weapons except for the revolver, because it was his favorite and didn't want to give it away yet. My dad instantly knew why, but didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, the guy shot himself with the revolver. He still hasn't got the revolver because the police still have it. He never told my grandpa that he knew, but he didn't want to take this guy's chance of ending his life on his own terms, instead of waiting for the cancer to win. Story 10. Not a lawyer, but I had an experience with this years ago. Rich uncle of mine, real crazy, not in a good way. He would come to visit us when we were kids, maybe once every 10 years. Last time he did, he brought us to a Denny's. He met my brother in an airport, was there for an hour before he got on another plane, and went home. When he died, he had no friends. He had driven his wife to basically drink herself to death a few years ago. He left his entire estate to an Elvis impersonator. Everything. Story 11. There's a famous UK case. One of the richest men in the world at the time died during the journey between his solicitor and his country estate, all because he forgot his glasses. Took lawyers just over 100 years to spend the entire estate in legal fees. The name of the case escapes me. Story 12. I was a witness to one where the lady wanted to make sure her daughter divorced her husband when she had no intentions of doing so, if she wanted her part of the estate. Thankfully, that is not legally enforceable, so nothing came from it. Story 13. This large French farming family had been fighting each other for 15 years over their parents' estate. Everything and anything had been a weapon in this all-out war. Debts, spoils, barns, plots, cows, wills, and whatever. Defeats followed victories, failures followed compromises, but progress was being made. And at some point, the killing zone turned to a standstill. Everything was agreed so long as no one talked about antics, jewelry, furniture, kitchenware, photographs, laundry, or tools. A long, protracted period ensued. Any goodwill, tentative, harshly discouraged before even being aired. Time went on with no issue in sight. Then someone suggested they'd just drag all the stuff into the farm's courtyard, pour petrol on it, and set it all on fire. Everyone agreed. Story 14. My brother used to be a paralegal, and he said that a group of 3 siblings, I believe 2 brothers and a sister, almost came to blows because the inheritance didn't divide into 3 evenly. There were 2 pennies left over. Story 15. Estate lawyer here. I could tell so many stories. Sisters fighting over deceased brother's dining room table, ending in an accusation that one had murdered her own husband. True believers who were convinced the rapture was imminent and only saw the value of completing their estate plan when I explained the mess those of us left behind would have to deal with, including their stuff. A guy who got married days before his death to a longtime girlfriend, long story, did a will, disinherited several kids, but not all, and somehow everything worked out okay with minimal disagreement. Several stories where a family member is a lawyer who practices in another area of law in another state, or doesn't practice at all. Guaranteed craziness. I could go on and on. It's the absolute best line of work. Super fulfilling, great stories, getting to know families, and walking meaningful paths alongside them. Story 16. I mean, it's not that crazy. It's depressingly predictable. Rich old aunt is the only one in her huge family with any money, having been a doctor on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She set up a living trust to take care of her poor relations in the Philippines, to continue as a death trust whenever she died. Her favorite niece was in control of the trust, and of course, the niece was responsible and even-handed and never ever embezzled any of the money to set herself up as a newspaper publisher and a concert producer and a media mogul with new expensive cars and lots of first-class Pan-Pacific travel. Nope, not her. Of course the trustee did all that. Hundreds of thousands of dollars missing, and an unholy mess of sifting through money transfers and property purchases in 3 countries. The niece also had a bigamous marriage to some loser in the Philippines. Her legal husband in North America was bedridden and dying slowly, to whom she sent buckets of her aunt's money to build a luxury villa. She vehemently denied such a relationship existed. She also had photos of the wedding on her Facebook page. Not the smartest embezzler out there. From where I sat, in the attorney's office representing the poor relations, trying to stop the trustee's embezzlement, the craziest part of it all was that after years of fighting, we finally got complete financial disclosure for the trust on, December 22nd, and it was such a Christmas miracle that I almost put off my Christmas trip to New York City to gleefully pore through every poorly redacted line of it. Also, we had the rich old aunt's ashes sitting on our bookshelf for years, since the dispute about what to do with her remains was part of it all. Story 17. My grandma's sister was a narcissist and extremely vindictive. She and her husband gained a significant number of assets over the years, including a somewhat profitable farm with over 100 acres of fields. They had a few children, all boys, and they all had wives and children of their own. Her husband died about 6 years before she did. Somehow, in their 50-plus years of marriage and living on said farm, they never bothered to go to a lawyer and write a will. Instead, she wrote a note and left it in their safe of legal documents saying that nothing was to go to wife of son who died almost 20 years ago, or her children, and said aunt's grandchildren. This because the son's wife was more outspoken and wouldn't be controlled by her. Aunt absolutely despised her, and my entire family too. So everything went into probate, and the kids are still trying to get everything squared away a year later, but the people she wanted excluded should be getting something out of it too. Story 18. The local newspaper ran a story with pictures of a house that was left to a cat when the owner died. The cat was the only occupant. The woman's lawyer maintained the house for the cat from the deceased owner's trust fund. I always wondered if there might have been a little motivation to hasten Kitty's demise. Story 19. Not so much the original will itself, but the aftermath and greed of the siblings. Almost none of them talk anymore, 10x total. They're fighting over a couple hundred acres, most of which is swamp. The greed part is that they had the original will amended. Every grandkid was supposed to get a portion in the original will, along with the siblings. However, the siblings nixed that via courts. They were going to then split the property among themselves, but the executor just didn't give a f*** and let it sit for 30 years without doing shit. The rest wanted it done, so court cases, massive debts. Finally, the executor no longer has control. Thanks to the court cases, the property was in massive debt, which is sort of paid off right now, and now they are all too old or dead to do anything with it. If the will had gone through as originally stated, the family, which consists of about 35 grandchildren, would have all been happy there or had money for selling the property, which is worth about $35K, a lot. Now it's probably just going to go under eventually for non-payment. Even if I could buy some of it for cheap, I'm not touching it with a 100-mile pole. Story 20. Fairly new lawyer, haven't had that much in wills areas. Family is where the real fun is, but did have a woman with dementia come in to do her will, then come in a few months later to change it, because her condition was worsening. I did a capacity assessment, and she seemed to understand what her old will said, what her new will would say, why she was changing it, wasn't suddenly cutting anyone close out, so I made the changes, told her okay, but warned her that I might not be able to make future changes due to concerns about her condition. A week later, she comes back in, and she's in rough shape. She remembers me, but her eyes are watering. She has some trouble explaining what's going on. I realize she's not even trying to change her will. She's just sort of here because she's scared about the changes in her head. So I get in touch with the person supposed to be caring for her. I talk over her will one more time. I tell her she's done everything right, her will is safe, her family knows where it is, etc. When I said goodbye, I told her I hoped to see her again, and she smiled and said she didn't think we would. I teared up a little. We'd laughed and chatted through her original will, discussing the best ways to do things. Seeing this formerly confident and witty woman, still keeping it together, but obviously so concerned about knowing it was a one-way downward path. It sucked. I don't know what she's doing now. Story 21. Not a lawyer, but when my dad was growing up, there was this little old lady across the street without any family. She was from Finland, and her husband died during World War II. She immigrated to the States and had no one, so my grandparents would knock on her door to chat, take her grocery shopping, etc. They made my dad and brother help out around her house/yard, etc. She loved my dad and uncle, treated them like her own kids, cookies and treats and presents. When my dad was in Vietnam, she would record his voice messages on tapes and send them to him with letters telling him what life was like in the neighborhood and how she hoped he'd be home safe soon, that she prayed for him, etc. When he came home, he'd stop by to chat and help out around the house, bring her macaroons and just sit and talk for a while. One day, Miss Lingard died, and a lawyer called my grandparents. She had left them a sizable amount of cash in stock, and her paid-off house to my dad and his brother. My family had thought she was penniless. Never underestimate how much little, simple things can mean to people. You just might be one of the best things in their life. Story 22. My school lucked into its art museum because of William Auckland's crazy will. He donated a ton of money to Duke for an art museum, on the condition that he be buried in the museum. Duke noped out of that little clause, and the money, so UNC happily accepted the gift, built the Auckland Art Center, and you can see his tomb right there in it. I enjoy sharing this fun little piece of trivia when I give tours. Story 23. I was in rehab with a guy whose grandmother left him $2.5 million if he could quit heroin for 2 years. He would have to wear one of those drug patches that the courts use for probationers the entire time, which are exceptionally hard to fool. $2.5 million. Slam dunk, right? This was 2007. Last time I saw him was in 2013, nodded the fuck out in a Fleabag motel, while I left to pick up another sack. I got arrested, made the decision to quit, and never saw him again. Who knows? Maybe since then he's cleaned up. Story 24. This family didn't realize I had nothing to do with the will. One kept telling me to tell the deceased they were unhappy with their decisions. Another thanked me personally for gifting them the house. Story 25. My grandpa gave all his belongings to my father, who was the youngest of 4 brothers and 3 sisters while my grandma was still alive. Grandpa told my dad that he gave him everything rightfully because he believed my dad would split everything equally. Grandma wanted her property back. Dad, at the time only 20, obeyed his mom. Big fucking court case several years later between all the brothers because it was indeed not evenly split. Still going strong to this day with no grandma around anymore. Grandpa was a wise man, just miscalculated. Story 26. My great-grandmother and grandfather had a will that would give their 6 kids a fair share when they both were dead. But my grandfather passed, and the oldest of the kids, the jerk, took it to court to get his part, even if the will said they would get their share when both were dead. This made my great-grandmother lose everything. She didn't get to handle the sorrow of losing her husband, whom she had been married to for 68 years. Instead, she had to go to court many times, and then she lost the house they had built and almost everything she owned. We helped her get an apartment and tried to keep her happy. She deteriorated quickly after those months. I hate how someone can let greed come between families. I've never met the jerk. Story 27. I have a grandpa who set up his will to divide his estate between his and his wife's, he remarried, families. Pretty normal so far. Stupid part is that rather than splitting his half between the 3 children, he did per capita to be distributed after his wife passed. So we currently have a 9-way split and likely 10 to 15 ways before it's actually settled. Story 28. Not a lawyer, but this is a story my great-aunt told me. It's basically just a lot of jealousy and family drama. I'm not good at telling stories, so please bear with me. There was an old woman. We'll refer to her as Granny or G, so I don't have to keep on saying old woman. Granny was a sweet old lady, relatively healthy, but had some trouble getting around and taking care of herself. Her family was the typical greedy and money-hungry scenario, only calling when they wanted something. I don't know the full story involving the family, but they stuck her in a nursing home and moved far away. To everyone's knowledge, Granny had very little money, but she still owned her property, a small house her best friend, my GA, took care of, and her car, a customized classic VW Bug. The nursing home had volunteers, people to come and talk to the residents, play board games with them, basically keep them occupied. Granny's favorite was a newer volunteer, a 19-year-old girl who I'll refer to as V. I only met her a handful of times, but V was a very soft-spoken and kind girl. V was the only volunteer Granny liked, because they had many things in common. One of those things being their mutual love for a specific kind of car. Over the next year and a half, V continued to volunteer about twice a week. Soon, Granny started to get sick. Her health started to rapidly decline. Did her family come to see her? Nope. Until her last days, she only had V and my GA. Granny died. Some of her family came to her funeral, but pretty much everyone only cared about the will. My GA said that the only ones who seemed sad at the funeral were herself, V, and a few of Granny's old friends. When it came time to read the will, there was a big shock. It turned out Granny had a decent amount of money stashed away, about $10,000. The family had no idea. Only my great-aunt knew about it all. A small amount of that was split up and given to select family members, but the rest was divided and given to my great-aunt and V. V was in complete shock. The family was was mad. A few other things were given to the family, select items that didn't hold a whole lot of value, but it was about to get worse. The car I mentioned earlier, the classic bug, Granny's teenage granddaughter had her eyes on that car since Granny was put in the nursing home. Everyone expected her to get it once G passed. That didn't happen though. Like I said, one of the things V and G bonded over was their love for bugs. G had shown V lots of pictures of her bug, and V enthusiastically told G all about her own bug. My great aunt wasn't really a fan of the car. I like trucks. And she said that she and Granny discussed leaving the bug to V in the will, which is exactly what G did. If the family was mad about the money, they were furious about the car. I've seen pictures. This thing was nice. Granny probably loved it more than anything. Maybe even my great aunt. According to her, V cried her eyes out, like she had to leave the room. She told my GA, "I can't accept it. I'm not family. That car should be yours." And my GA spent over an hour and a half convincing her that G wanted her to have it. Some family members followed V outside and started screaming at her, threatening to sue her, claiming it was part of a plan V must have created. What? Befriend a lonely old woman and take her fortune? Telling her she didn't deserve any of what she got and calling her awful things. One of the calmer relatives got things settled down and my GA got V out of there. It's been a few years. My great aunt and V still talk, and V still has Granny's bug. As far as I know, after the reading of the will was over, V got a lot of nasty messages online, but was otherwise fine. One of the family members did contact a lawyer, but they must have told them there was nothing that could be done since V never actually got sued or anything. Story 29. There was a case, story from someone who was in law school, of a generational trust. This says, all my grandchildren get money when the youngest reaches the age of 25. The youngest grandchild was 24, and they were all making plans for their inheritance. Plot twist, one of the sons remarried and had a baby, a new heir, when the other grandchildren were 24, so they had to wait until they were 50 plus to inherit. Story 30. Not in the will, but my mother left her estate to me, and my 4 brothers. Share and share alike. My oldest brother was physically and mentally disabled. A few days before she died, she asked one of my brothers to have all of us turn our shares over to my disabled brother. Keep in mind, he was getting disability, lived in a nice group home, and had all of his medical covered, and risked losing this if he had any substantial assets. Also, my brother, who spoke to my mother, asked that the money be put into an irrevocable trust. This means that if my brother passed, the money would go to the state of Pennsylvania. My brother was in very poor health, and my mother's wishes were never codified into her written will. We met for a breakfast meeting, me and my 3 other brothers, and 2 of us agreed to the trust, and me and another brother did not. There was no bad blood, and we all respected each other's decisions. While my brother was in the process of setting up the trust, our disabled brother died of natural causes related to this disability. 2 of us had chosen to not make an emotional decision in the wake of my mother's death, and in the end, her wishes never came to fruition because of my brother's death. But if we had all agreed to these wishes, the state of Pennsylvania would have made out like a bandit. Worse yet, I have an adult disabled daughter, and was much more fluent in the ins and outs of providing for a disabled child. I didn't want to come across as greedy or mean, but I knew what the irrevocable trust meant, and they didn't.